Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about the life of Muhammad. If you want to have a more deeper look, you can, of course, watch the movie called The Message, produced in 1976, I believe. The director was a Muslim who made enough money producing horror movies to essentially bankroll a Hollywood-style Ten Commandments-like production of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and apparently did it both in Arabic and in English. And this movie is still commonly screened, I believe, in the Arab world. And it's a sort of classic feature. You can see both, you basically have high quality English speaking actors, but then there's also the same versions with Arabic language. And that movie is based off of the traditional sources, which we'll talk about, basically different biographies of the Prophet Muhammad that were written about 200, 300 years afterwards, and then constantly reimagined and reinvented, as we'll see, illustrated in different ways. But what I want to do today is just give you an overview of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, what led up to the revelation of the Quran, and how did this all come together. So as you guys might remember, when we're looking at Arabia around 600, so by the time that the Prophet Muhammad is alive, but before he has received his revelation, what we see is essentially an area with cities to the north. This is basically Greater Syria, Palestine, etc., controlled by the Byzantines. We have Iraq here, which is basically the heartland of the Sasanian Empire, with the capital of Ctesiphon. And then here we have a variety of different small settlements, usually based around oases, such as Khaybar, Yathrib, Makkah, Taif, etc. In this section, you can see there's basically no settlements. This is the so-called empty quarter, because this is just like gigantic sand dune desert. There's no way for humans to really live there. And we have basically some settlements on this western coast, the area called the Hejaz, and the other area here in eastern Arabia, kind of Bahrain, or what is known as the Bahrain here. And then Yemen and Oman, which are not part of Arabia necessarily, which are much more mountainous and much more verdant, constitute other places with their own settlements and often large populations. And in fact, there was even a Himyarite Jewish kingdom here between the 3rd to the 5th centuries. And of course, over here in Aksum, there's an Ethiopic Christian kingdom. Now, in this Arabian area, there's no state, right? Most of it is run by tribes. People are living either in settled areas around oases, doing date cultivation, raising vegetables, grain, etc. Or there are nomadic groups moving animals, camels, goats, etc., back and forth to some pasture land. This is not a very rich area. There's very little things are produced. Maybe some of the pelts and hides are being sent to the Romans for their army needs. But otherwise, there's really not much wealth being generated here. They're not even in charge of much trade moving from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. As we'll see, the Prophet Muhammad was some a merchant and leading, caravans, etc., to places like Syria. But this is not a central place. And in fact, this is the reason why there's no state control of these areas, because there wasn't enough tax revenue to justify the effort of controlling this space. And instead, what states did was essentially use proxies, paid different tribal groups to essentially control these nomads and to keep them from raiding settled populations. Within each of these areas or these settlements, there would be a sanctuary space. So if you were to go to Mecca at that time, there would be a sanctuary known as the Haram, where you would be able to conduct trade and in which physical violence was clearly forbidden. Within this space, there would also be usually somewhere to put idols, some sort of worship space for these tribes, especially if they were migratory, to leave their idols and then come back every year for a sort of yearly pilgrimage. That space would have been the so-called Kaaba in Mecca, a square stone structure in which there would have been placed inside a variety of different idols, and we'll get back to that in a bit. The point of having a sanctuary space is that it facilitated trade and allowed different tribes to come together and to engage with each other without having to fight, right? So again, this is a place without a state. There are no technical laws. If someone wronged you in any way, you would have to do recourse through basically your tribe and demand that they settle your dispute for you or extract revenge. So if you, let's say, your camels were stolen or someone's brother was killed, etc., you would demand blood money or the right to kill someone else from that tribe, etc. And so it actually, the head of tribal groups were responsible for their followers, whether those were literal members of the tribe by blood or they were clients that were taken on, and this is often the case. And so, for example, if a client murdered someone or did something unjust, then the head of that tribe had to be responsible and had to protect and speak for whoever they had taken on through oaths and so forth. What else do we have in these spaces? We basically have a way for often feuding tribes, tribes that might not get along, or they're basically constantly fighting with each other in different little mini ways to get along and interact in these spaces. And Mecca was one of these, and you can see this in this illustration from the 16th century. This is an illustrated version of the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And within them, this space, there is a man named Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. He was born probably around 570. He was born in Mecca. And he belonged to the primary tribe of this area, which is called the Quraysh. All these tribes have basically clans, sub-clans, right? Groups within them. Not everyone is exactly part of the same thing. The tribe is sort of a larger organization that collects all these different clans and sub-clans, etc. He was part of a clan called the Hashim clan. And apparently very early on, his parents died, and he was actually raised by his uncle Abu Talib, right? So we already see Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. He has an uncle who's just called by the name Abu Talib, the father of Talib. Eventually, he was able to become a merchant. I don't think he was particularly successful or rich, but he did marry a rich widow named Khadija. That would be his first wife. And around the age of 40, while he's already traveling, he's probably traveling to Syria, engaging and interacting to some degree with Christians there. And in fact, there would be Christian settlements over the edges of Arabia, and there would already be Jewish tribes and people throughout the oases of Arabia. He, around the age of 40, he would retreat to a cave, and according to the traditional biographies, it's there in which he encounters the archangel Gabriel. Gabriel basically tells him to, he says, recite. And he says, what is being recited? He says, recite from your heart. And this is the revelation of which God gives to his prophet, Muhammad. Muhammad is ultimately known as the seal of the prophets because he's the last one to receive the revelation of God. He's the final prophet. And he's the final prophet in a chain of prophets that have occurred in human history, in which God has tried to reveal his religion. And as we'll see, so basically Judaism and Christianity, etc., are all versions of this true religion, but they've basically strayed from the correct path and have been corrupted a bit. So Muhammad starts receiving this revelation. This revelation is then repeated to its followers. And this is the Quran. The Quran basically means the recitation. And he's reciting the literal words of God, which have been inscribed onto his heart in the Arabic language to his friends and followers. So again, his first followers are basically his wife, his cousin, and future son-in-law Ali, other people like Zayd, I believe his servant / slave, and people like Abu Bakr and Uthman, close colleagues of his. And he's also preaching this in public, right? So he's preaching this to the Meccans. One of the things that he's emphasizing again and again is that there is only one God, that this is an extreme form of monotheism, and that other visions of religiosity, which in this point are basically polytheistic within these Arab oases, are wrong and should be rejected. In fact, rather than having multiple gods in the Kaaba or in the sanctuary, we should only be praying to one God, and that God has no body or corporeal attributes. It cannot be seen exactly. And that is kind of his message. It's a message of radical monotheism. As I pointed out, there was already familiarity with different forms of monotheism. There's Christians already in Syria, in Iraq, places that he probably would have traveled to as a merchant. There's already Jews within these oasis towns, and there's something called some sort of Arabian monotheists, which seem to have existed in many of these places. And he builds a small following within the Quraysh tribe, within Mecca. But because he is seen as a danger, and he's, again, insulting basically the idols of these polytheistic Arabs, and also attacking core beliefs and ideas and often social structures, he becomes eventually the target of different attacks. One of the people that attacks him is a guy named Abu Jahl, which literally means like father, possessor of ignorance, or the most ignorant, or something like that. But here it's just a name. And he's one of the people that kind of leads the attacks on the Prophet Muhammad. On the right here, we see the Prophet Muhammad depicted in this halo. Of course, you don't see his face, but you see the back of his turban. Just like you would in the movie, here too, not directly depicted. And we see him in front of this Kaaba, where people are praying to the various idols, and he's ends up rejecting them. At this point, Muhammad is continuing to receive revelations, but he's getting more and more tension as he goes along. And he basically has a problem. He has some protection. Basically, his uncle Abu Talib, who's a major figure within the Quraysh tribe, is making sure that he is not being attacked by other members of the tribe, and that he's saying, if anyone harms Muhammad, he'll have to answer to me. But this goes away. Abu Talib dies in 619. So a few years after he started to receive the revelations, and he started to gather more and more followers. His wife, Khadija, who is also kind of a powerful person, she also dies. And he's faced with a problem. He needs essentially sanctuary for his followers, because his followers are being attacked. They can no longer be clearly protected. And so he needs to find a different protector or a different tribe to kind of take him on and sponsor him. And he already sends out different emissaries here and there to find such tribes. And for a while, it looks like maybe he'll find some place in Taif, but it doesn't work out. At a certain point, these followers who are now outside of the tribal structure don't have clear protection. Some of them are even sent to Ethiopia, to Abyssinia, to seek refuge with the Ethiopian Christian king there. And so a small group goes there, and he decides not to move himself in the core community there completely, but he does send some people out there. They eventually come back. After a few years of negotiations, there is a space that he finds that is able to invite him, and that is this settlement called Yathrib, which will later be called Medina. He's invited to sort of be a political leader and mediator between the different tribes and groups of Yathrib. Perhaps they saw these tribes of Yathrib saw within Muhammad a prophetic figure. We'll see in a second. He's invited over to there, and he migrates with his community from Mecca to Yathrib. That moment of migration is called the Hijrah. And this is the start of year 0, or rather year 1 of the Islamic calendar. So if you look at any date in the Islamic sources, they're given in what's called the Hijri calendar, and that is basically counted from 622. Now, it's a bit complicated because the Islamic calendar is based off of a lunar calendar, so it's actually 2 weeks shorter than the solar calendar. So every Hijri year is 2 weeks shorter. So over time, there's more Hijri years in a solar century than 100. That makes sense. You don't really have to worry about it. Just keep in mind that year 0, 622, is an important date because that's the start of the Islamic calendar. Everything before that time is often referred to as an age of Jahiliyyah, or age of ignorance, age of disbelief, unbelief. Now, what did he find in Medina, which Medina means city or settlement, is another way of calling Yathrib. He had within him a variety of immigrants called muhajirun, right? So to go back to the root hajara, people who did hijrah. Muhajirun are his supporters who moved from Mecca, the closest ones, and they're establishing themselves in a new city called Medina, or Yathrib. Within Medina itself, he has supporters. These are called, or helpers, called Ansar. These supporters came to Muhammad because Medina, unlike most settlements, was not dominated by one tribe. In fact, there was 2 clans of the same tribe, the Aus and the Khazraj, and a number of Jewish tribes/clans, the Nadir, the Qurayza, and the Kainuka. Basically, there was the Jewish clans were agriculturists. They were doing date cultivation and farming. And apparently there was constant back and forth fighting between all these different clans. It might have been that the Jewish clans threatened to bring their great prophet or leader and to punish these other polytheistic clans. Once these Aus and Khazraj clans heard about the rise of a sort of prophet leader in Mecca, they thought, well, maybe this is the person that the Jews were threatening us with. They said, well, let's go get him on our side before the Jews find him. And they possibly brought him into this area for that. In any case, there was an idea that Muhammad would be a sort of mediator / leader figure to settle the debates between all these different clans and tribes. And Muhammad quickly settles down, and as always, there's problems of trying to figure out how does he avoid showing favoritism to any one person, etc. How is he going to decide where to settle down? One of these ways that he did it by kind of releasing his camel and deciding to settle down wherever that camel stopped to graze. So a sort of randomness to it. And there he establishes house with a courtyard, which is also essentially the mosque, which is the meeting space and worship space of the community. And it's not, again, very fancy. He's basically living close by to this mosque or masjid. He has almost no furniture. He might have, one cushion. It's not a particularly luxurious lifestyle, and it's, his emphasis is again on taking care of his followers and continuing to receive the revelation of God in the form of the Quran, of these verses that are being recited to him and revealed to him. In this moment, he creates a political community, which is called the Ummah. And we're going to look at what exactly was the Ummah in a sort of document, which seems to be relatively accurate and from the time period, which lays out the different rights and obligations of all these different groups. Now, through this time, he had a set of continued problems with the Meccans. On one hand, his followers were not able to, have agricultural land. They weren't farming. They didn't really have a way of supporting themselves. And like all kind of nomadic or tribal peoples, one of the easiest things to do was essentially start to raid caravans. And so he started raiding the caravans of the polytheistic Meccans. So the Meccans would be sending trade caravans out to the north, etc., and they would be raiding these caravans to sustain themselves. And in that process, also making a variety of alliances with different polytheistic nomad tribes. At this point, not asking them to convert, but just making political alliances with them. This led him again into a variety of fights and battles with the Meccans. And one of these in the Battle of Badr in 624, he's actually quite successful. But it doesn't always go to his benefit. In the Battle of Uhud. The Meccans attack Medina to stop Muhammad, and he's actually defeated, not completely, of course, but it's a loss for his side. And this repeats in the sort of the Battle of the Trench, the Khandak, where they dug these sort of large trenches, apparently based off of the Persian model, to stop cavalry charges. The Meccans are trying to lay siege to Medina, but this ultimately falls apart, and the Meccans lose. This is, by the way, a depiction of the Battle of Uhud. It probably didn't look exactly like this. This is a much later depiction, but you can see Prophet Muhammad, its commanders, and then the different armies kind of depicted here, and a lot of decapitated heads and people missing body, limbs, etc. Each of these battles also increases Muhammad's power and his ability to coalesce power within the local community of Medina. And it allows him to eliminate what he calls hypocrites, enemies, munafiqun, from both within the realm of the polytheistic tribes, the Khaws and the Awzraj, and also to eliminate his enemies within the Jewish clans in Medina. So some of them, each battle basically means that especially the Jewish tribes are increasingly pushed out of Medina. This is not necessarily out of any sort of religious rejection. Obviously, the Jews didn't decide to, most of them didn't decide to join directly the Prophet Muhammad's political community, even though they were joined in this Ummah, group. But there was, of course, always fights over resources and leadership and exactly what was going on at each point. After, for example, the Battle of Badr, the Kainuka tribe is forced to flee after the Battle of Uhud. The Nadir tribe flees again outside to Khaybar, another settlement further north. And after the Battle of the Trench, or the Battle of the Khandak, the Qurayza tribe, most dramatically, the men are killed and the women and children are enslaved and integrated into the early community of the Prophet Muhammad. In this process, we see basically different changes to reshare this. We see different changes to the nature of the community. We still have a constant flexibility in the nature of worship and of basic ideas. So, for example, initially there's a lot of similarities between forms of worship in Islam and the Prophet Muhammad's community and Judaism. In fact, what we'll see is that a lot of the basic beliefs and functions of Islam were actually codified, not even in Medina, but much later on after the Prophet's lifetime. So, for example, the direction of prayer was initially directed towards Jerusalem, which is also what Jews were doing. But over the course of this period, and also I think probably later, that direction was pointed towards Mecca. So the sanctuary that they're guided towards is not Jerusalem, where the previous temple, etc., was, but towards the sanctuary at Mecca. Originally, the Prophet's community and followers were praying 3 times a day, and now he changes it to 5 times a day. He switches to the calendar to a non-fixed lunar calendar. So Jews have essentially also a lunar calendar, but they adjust it so that it kind of matches with the solar year. What that means is that the holidays like the New Year's, Rosh Hashanah, or Passover, Pesach, are on different dates every year, but are in generally the same period. The non-fixed lunar calendar doesn't bring in that adjustment. So that means that Ramadan, etc., or any of the holidays are not at the same time of the year every year. So every year they become 2 weeks earlier and earlier until after, 26 years, the cycle basically repeats itself. So if Ramadan, for example, this year is in June or May, next year it'll be 2 weeks earlier, etc. And you have to wait another 26 years until it'll come back to the same period in May. And basically, there's also a shift in other practices. For example, fasting days. There was a fasting day on Ashura, which means the 10th day, very similar to the Jewish one. This is shifted over to an entire month of fasting called the Ramadan. And so slowly what he's doing is basically differentiating his specific religion. And if you'll notice, here, I'm not trying to avoid using the term Muslims because this is actually not the term that was commonly used at this period. In fact, the community was called believers, etc. He's changing slowly the types of rituals associated with his community and making them more unique. Eventually, these battles, Muhammad is able to consolidate his power, create enough alliances with different polytheistic tribes, and to gain more and more followers throughout Arabia, that he gains a good amount of power. Who are his followers? Often they're people from weaker clans within larger tribes who want to use the connections with Muhammad and his growing movement to increase their rights and their privileges within their clan and see this as an opportunity to become stronger. And of course, people who also believe in this message and are brought into this new monotheism. In 628, you basically have this Hudaybiyah agreement. It's a truce between Muhammad and the Meccans. They decide to stop fighting. He's allowed to go on an unarmed march to conduct a sort of minor pilgrimage, what's called an Umrah in Mecca. And he agrees to come back next year in exchange for a truce, basically. And by pausing these attacks and wars with the Meccans, he's able to consolidate his territory in different areas to take over another oasis called Khaybar, further to the north. And there's basically different discussions over what ends up breaking this truce, whether the Meccans annulled it by attacking the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, or whether exactly, perhaps the Prophet Muhammad broke this truce in different ways. Long story short, basically this truce breaks apart at 630 after 2 years. At this point, the Prophet Muhammad has a very large army, many more followers, is much actually stronger than the Meccans themselves, and he marches on Mecca in 630, 8 years after being forced out of Mecca into Medina. He comes back and takes over Mecca, which surrenders without a fight. And we can see here some of the things that he does. Obviously doesn't destroy Mecca in any way. But one of the things he does as part of this message of radical monotheism is to go into the Kaaba, this stone structure in the middle of the sanctuary, and to take away all the idols and destroy them. You can see here painted in gold. And to kind of turn this space into a center of monotheism. And in fact, this is the Kaaba around which people circumambulate today when they go on the Hajj. At this point, Muhammad has different issues. First is that should he punish the Meccans who were so mean to him and rejected him and pushed him out of Mecca directly? And he ultimately decides not to. He takes his enemies from the Meccans and actually appoints them into high positions within his army and within his group. So he takes people like Abu Sufyan and Abu Sufyan's sons and gives them high positions. He basically integrates his enemies in Mecca into the new community. And this obviously creates some tensions because this group, these very same people just 8 years prior had pushed out the first followers of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca. And this was seen as unjust. And also there was, many more followers, earlier followers from Medina and so forth, who thought that they should be given high positions, etc. But Muhammad ultimately chose this way of trying to create a broader coalition. At the same time, he's moving against expanding further. He defeats a different tribe called the Thaqif, takes over a different settlement called Taif. The polytheists with whom he had allied before, who had not officially been his followers, now he turns against them and forcefully incorporates them as his followers. He performs the Hajj. He basically goes to Mecca while again moving and conducting different raids and attacks. He returns, performs the Hajj in 632. Afterwards, he returns back to Medina, and there he dies. Right, so it's only been about 10 years since the Prophet Muhammad has fled from Medina. It's been maybe 15 years since he has received the revelation of God in the form of the Quran. And throughout this time, he's continuing to receive revelation. Now, with his death, a few important things occur. One is that there is no clearly nominated successor. And it's quite clear that Muhammad has avoided making any one person his clear successor. He keeps power dispersed amongst a whole variety of different followers, and that's probably one of the reasons why he brought in his former Meccan enemies into positions of leadership. He basically gives the right to raid or to lead military expeditions to different varieties of people. The most common one is to his personal freedman, so his former slave, Zayd, who is still very much a loyal client and is only connected to Muhammad. He gives him in charge of a variety of military expeditions more often, but overall he doesn't clearly delineate a succession. And he also makes it clear, I think, that basically the prophecy ends with him, right? He's the seal of the prophets. After his death, depicted here on the left, there is not going to be a continued form of revelation or other forms of prophet. His successors are not prophets in the same way that he was. The other thing that's also unclear is just where is the new community going to go? What exactly is owed in terms of allegiance? Is allegiance to the new kind of religion or new community, or was it the allegiance, for example, these polytheistic tribes that had been brought in? Are they allied with Muhammad as long as he's alive, or are they allied to this new religion / religious community? One last thing to keep in mind is the question of why is it that Muhammad ultimately creates an Arabian religion, right? He creates a separate religion, a separate religious community, rather than join one of the pre-existing monotheistic communities. And we already see this, right? So in Christianity, it spread and moved all over Syria and Iraq in different ways, and people moved from polytheism to Christianity, or in certain cases, like in the Himyarite kingdoms or in the Oases, to Judaism. But ultimately, Muhammad chooses to form a different religious community, and we talked about how the idea of having a religious community is one of the markers of late antique society, one that is independent and ultimately separate from that of the Jews and the Christians. Though, as we'll talk in the next class, one of the current constant debates is what exactly was the nature of this religious community? How clearly defined were its precepts, its beliefs? What were its boundaries? Were Jews and Christians and other monotheists part of it or not? And we're going to look into that in the coming lessons. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.